At exactly 6 in the morning on the day I moved in, with the sky still gray and the moving truck just starting to hiss its brakes outside my new driveway, a shrill voice split the air and made the movers drop their boxes. I had not yet even unlocked the front door when a woman in a floral robe charged across the lawn like a general leading troops into battle, screaming that I could not unload a single box without her approval. The absurdity of it was cinematic, like some reality show gone wrong, except this was my actual life. She jabbed a clipboard at my chest and shouted that she decided who lived here and that my truck would be towed before sunrise. Behind her, a few blinds in neighboring windows twitched as half-awake faces peeked out, waiting to see what would happen next. My pulse quickened, partly from disbelief, partly from the realization that the very nightmare I had been warned about in whispers online was now standing in my yard, demanding obedience as if she owned my soul. I took a slow breath, aware the movers were frozen, and I smiled just enough to let her know that whatever game she was playing was about to change forever. That was the first 10 minutes of living next to her. By the end of the first hour, I understood why the previous owners had bolted in the middle of the night. By the end of the first day, I had a plan. The house itself was a strange anomaly, a parcel carved out decades ago before the HOA ever existed. The old man who built it had made sure it stayed outside their covenants, and when I stumbled on it in a foreclosure auction, I knew immediately it was my chance at a quiet life, a small slice of freedom. But standing there with Karen breathing down my neck, waving a fake citation, I began to see how freedom on paper was not the same as freedom in practice. She barked out a list of rules about mailbox height, grass color, and driveway paint. I countered each one with a printout from the county zoning office, but she ignored the paperwork like it was a menu at a restaurant she didn't want to eat at. The movers snickered quietly, sensing the absurdity, as she tried to hand me a fine for parking on my own driveway. By midday I had unpacked just enough to set up a chair on my porch and watch her patrol the street. She stood in the cul-de-sac with a walkie-talkie, whispering into it like she had backup, glaring at me through oversized sunglasses. It would have been hilarious if not for the intensity with which she spoke, like she believed she truly was a sheriff of some private town. I noticed every neighbor who drove past slowed down to glance at my property but sped up when they saw her watching. That's when it hit me that she had built an empire of fear here, and I was the first real challenger to it. As the day went on, she escalated. She put up handwritten, "No trespassing" signs on my hedge. She dropped a stack of HOA newsletters on my porch, each one circled in red marker as if it were a court order. When I ignored her, she pounded on my door and demanded my phone number for emergency contact. I told her I would be happy to provide it to the city inspector instead. She stared at me, stunned, before marching off muttering about calling the board. In that moment, a slow grin formed on my face because I knew something she didn't. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just some random buyer. My day job as a licensed contractor had me deeply embedded with the city's permitting department. Over the years I had helped more than a few inspectors navigate the HOA's labyrinth of complaints, and I knew every zoning loophole like the back of my hand. In my pocket was a folder full of stamped approvals for renovations she hadn't even dreamed of yet, including a 6-foot privacy fence that would block her view entirely. I had been waiting for the perfect time to use it, and her outburst had just given me that opening. As dusk fell, a storm rolled in, dark clouds swirling over the tidy roofs of her kingdom. She was out there again, pointing her phone at my property and snapping photos like she was collecting evidence for a trial. The neighbors peeked from their windows, eyes flicking between her and me, and I could feel their curiosity building. I unpacked my last box, set my chair on the porch, and cracked a soda. When she shouted one last threat about a board meeting to vote me out, I simply raised my drink and said I looked forward to attending. Her mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out, before she spun on her heel and stomped back to her house. That night, as the storm broke and rain hammered down, I reviewed my folder one more time under the soft light of my kitchen. The sound of thunder made the walls vibrate, and in the flashes of lightning I saw the potential for everything to change. She believed she had power over me, but she had no idea the ground she stood on was about to shift. In that moment I wasn't just unpacking a house. I was setting the stage for the most satisfying showdown this neighborhood had ever seen. Chapter 1 of my new life had begun with a scream at dawn and would end with a reckoning at dusk. And as I shut off the kitchen light, I couldn't help but smile at the thought that Karen's perfect little world had no idea what kind of neighbor had just moved in next door. By the following morning Karen had shifted gears from barking orders to playing tactical games, as though our first encounter had been a chess opening and now she was advancing pawns across my property line. She began with the mailbox, attaching a laminated HOA warning that my mail slot was not compliant, which was funny because my address was never in their system. She stuck neon orange stickers on my trash cans and posted flyers claiming there would be a block-wide driveway inspection. It was the kind of pettiness you'd expect in a sitcom, except the consequences were real and the tension was rising. I let her finish her little display before stepping outside with a mug of coffee, taking care to make eye contact with the neighbors who were watching from their porches, and then calmly peeled each sticker off, dropped them into a bag, and walked back inside without a word. The look on her face as her theatrics failed to produce a reaction was worth $100. That afternoon, her retaliation escalated. A landscaping crew she'd hired for the HOA appeared at my curb and tried to rope off a strip of my front lawn, claiming it was a common area. I stepped out with my property plat and city survey map, tracing the boundary line with my finger in front of them. The crew, realizing they'd been misled, apologized and left. Karen stood on the sidewalk clutching her phone like a detonator, eyes darting between the retreating workers and my calm expression. It was the first time she seemed genuinely unsure of herself, and the air felt charged with a new kind of electricity. I spent the rest of the week using my contractor knowledge to file a set of permits that would infuriate her but remain entirely legal. A tall privacy fence along the edge of my lot, a second driveway gate, and a complete redesign of the front yard landscaping were all stamped and approved before she even knew they existed. While she wasted her mornings scribbling fake citations, I was walking out of City Hall with fresh blueprints in hand. Each time a permit was approved, I pinned it to my kitchen corkboard and imagined her face when the work began. Then came the first major twist. While checking the zoning history for my permits, I stumbled across a public record of the HOA's financial filings. Hidden in plain sight were discrepancies. Budget items that didn't match bank statements, invoices billed to non-existent contractors, and several payments routed to an LLC in Karen's maiden name. It was small-town corruption at its most brazen, and it gave me leverage I hadn't planned on. As I read deeper, I realized she had been using HOA funds to maintain her own property, pay for her nephew's landscaping business, and even install a hot tub for community meetings that only she used. This changed everything. With this information in hand, I began quietly reaching out to the more timid neighbors. Over cups of coffee and whispered conversations at the local diner, I showed them the document. Their reactions ranged from shock to barely contained laughter. Years of frustration at Karen's arbitrary fines and invasive patrols suddenly had a focal point. They didn't want to be the first to challenge her, but now they had evidence and someone willing to lead the charge. By the end of the week, I had a small but determined group ready to attend the next HOA board meeting and ask questions Karen couldn't answer. Of course, she sensed something was shifting. The following Saturday she staged a community event on the cul-de-sac, complete with a bounce house and a DJ blasting outdated pop songs. She handed out flyers calling it a celebration of neighborhood unity, but it was clearly designed to rally her loyalists and isolate me. I played along, walking over with a plate of cookies and a stack of my approved permits, chatting pleasantly with anyone who would listen. Every time she tried to corner me with a new accusation, I responded with a gentle question about budget line items, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of her followers. Her smile became tighter and tighter as the afternoon wore on. That night, after the last balloon deflated and the DJ packed up his gear, she left a letter taped to my door claiming she would be initiating legal action against me for community disruption. The language was blustery but empty, and I could tell she was running out of move. I took the letter, slid it into my growing folder of evidence, and started drafting my own statement for the city inspector and the local paper. If she wanted a fight, she was about to get one she couldn't control. As the week ended, construction trucks began rolling up with my fencing materials. Neighbors leaned out of their windows and some even waved, the tide of public opinion slowly turning in my favor. Karen stormed out to protest but was met with my foreman showing her the signed permit. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water before she retreated back inside. It was the first time she hadn't tried to bluff or threaten. She was cornered, and we both knew it. Sitting on my porch as dusk settled, I thought about how quickly this had escalated from a simple move-in dispute to a battle for the soul of the street. What had begun as a single confrontation at dawn was now a cold war of documents, permits, and secrets. The humor of it was that she still believed she had the upper hand, while the drama lay in how close she was to losing everything she had built. The surprises weren't over yet, and the stakes were only getting higher. I could see the cracks forming in her carefully crafted image of authority, and I knew that Chapter 2 of this conflict was about to spill into an even bigger stage. In the shadows of the porch light I smiled, knowing that by the time Chapter 3 unfolded, Karen would no longer be the one deciding who lived here. The third chapter of our saga began with a tension that felt almost electric, as if the entire street was holding its breath. Word had spread about the upcoming HOA board meeting, and for the first time in years the turnout promised to be enormous. I arrived early, dressed neatly and carrying a single folder with the financial records I had uncovered, the stamped permits for my renovations, and a copy of the county's property boundary map. Karen was already inside the small community center, pacing by the podium, clutching her notes like a weapon. Her eyes followed me as I walked past the rows of folding chairs, neighbors whispering and shifting nervously. She tried to smile, but it was brittle, more of a grimace than a display of control. As the meeting was called to order, she launched into a tirade about me disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood, throwing around words like nuisance, violation, and expulsion, but each accusation fell flatter than the last because everyone could see my property was clearly outside their jurisdiction. When she tried to display photos of my new fence as evidence of wrongdoing, I simply raised my permits and let the inspector from the city confirm them as valid. The room buzzed with low laughter and murmurs, the tide visibly turning against her. I waited until she had spent her fury and then asked for the floor. With deliberate calm, I laid out the financial discrepancies I had discovered, passing photocopies to each board member. A hush fell over the room as they scanned the pages and saw the names of shell companies and repeated charges to Karen's personal account. The neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out began shifting forward in their seats, whispering to each other, some even pulling out their phones to take pictures. Karen tried to cut me off, shouting about confidentiality, but the treasurer stood up and demanded an explanation for the missing funds. The moment was dramatic, like a courtroom scene where the villain realizes the jury has turned. She stammered, accused me of falsifying documents, but the city inspector confirmed they were real public record. One by one the board members began asking pointed questions she couldn't answer. It was a slow unraveling, her authority dissolving like sugar in hot coffee. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, but inside the room was heavy with the scent of panic and shifting power. When the meeting adjourned, Karen stormed out without her usual entourage, leaving the board members to talk quietly among themselves. Several of them came over to thank me, some sheepishly admitting they had long suspected something but lacked proof. One even whispered that a vote to remove her as president would be held within days. It was clear the empire she had built on intimidation and false authority was cracking apart. I walked out into the parking lot feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation, the kind you feel when a storm breaks but the lightning hasn't yet reached the ground. The next morning, Karen tried one last stunt. She called a local news station claiming she was being harassed by a rogue neighbor violating community rules. A camera crew rolled up while she gestured at my property, spinning a story about chaos and lawlessness. But before she could finish her performance, one of the neighbors she had wronged for years stepped forward and told the reporters about the missing funds and her pattern of abuse. Another neighbor produced my permits on camera, and the whole narrative flipped in real time. The footage that aired that evening showed her looking frantic and cornered while I stood quietly on my porch, hands in my pockets, offering a brief statement about property rights and transparency. Viewers across the county saw her not as a heroic defender of the neighborhood, but as a petty tyrant whose reign was ending. Within a week, the HOA board voted to remove her from the presidency, citing financial misconduct and harassment. She was stripped of her power, her threats became empty echoes, and her influence over the neighborhood dissolved overnight. In a final act of irony, the very fence she had raged against became the backdrop for her departure when moving trucks appeared at her driveway, hauling away her things. Neighbors emerged from their houses to watch, some bringing lawn chairs as though it were a parade, murmuring their good riddance under their breath. I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, the same spot where she had first confronted me, and watched her drive off in a huff, the oversized sunglasses failing to hide her glare. As the dust settled, the street transformed. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved as they walked their dogs. Kids played in the cul-de-sac without being scolded for breaking imaginary rules. Mailboxes and trash cans went back to normal colors. A sense of relief swept over the community like a fresh wind through open windows. I planted a small garden by my new fence, and several people offered cuttings from their own yards as a gesture of friendship. It was as though by removing her grip, we had all reclaimed a part of ourselves. Sitting there on a golden afternoon, I reflected on how a single property line had become the front line of a quiet war. What had started as an absurd morning showdown with a clipboard had turned into a high-stakes campaign of evidence, patience, and strategic move. There had been humor in her outlandish tactics, drama in her unraveling, and satisfaction in watching a community find its voice. The twists had been real, from discovering the financial records to watching the news clip flip the narrative on its head. The stakes had been high not just for me but for everyone on the street, because it was about more than fences and permit. It was about who gets to claim power and how far one person can push before others push back. As I leaned back in my chair and listened to the distant sound of children laughing, where once there had been only her scolding voice, I knew that moving into this house had been more than a real estate deal. It had been an invitation to change a neighborhood, and in doing so to change myself. And in that quiet moment after the storm, with the fence standing tall and the street finally at peace, I felt the kind of satisfaction that comes not from winning but from freeing others to live without fear.